Luke Skywalker felt the familiar hum of the Force surround him, a calm he had come to rely on throughout countless battles, meditations, and confrontations with the dark side. Yet now, the sensation was different, distorted, almost suffocating. It was as if the Force itself had been twisted, stretched across dimensions he had never known. One moment, he had been on a routine patrol through the Outer Rim, the stars streaking past the Millennium Falcon's viewport, the galaxy as familiar as a friend's face. The next, a violent surge of energy had yanked him from his seat, tearing him through space and reality until he landed hard on ground that seemed unreal, unstable, and alive. The air vibrated with a tension he had never sensed before. It pressed against his skin and invaded his lungs, filling him with a sense of dread. Around him, the sky was not a sky at all, but a shifting haze of colors, black, crimson, and sickly green that writhed like liquid fire. Stars did not twinkle in this void, they screamed, appearing and disappearing in impossible patterns that made his stomach lurch. The ground beneath his feet was jagged, a dark crystalline landscape that pulsed faintly as if it were breathing. Every step he took echoed in ways that seemed too large, too resonant, as though the world itself was mocking his presence. He sensed something in the distance, a presence so overwhelming it caused the hair on his arms to rise. It was not alive in the way creatures were alive, yet it was aware of him, its consciousness seeping into his own thoughts like an intrusive shadow. He reached for the Force, trying to draw comfort from its embrace, but the currents felt different here. The light side was no longer a guiding warmth. It was a faint glimmer, fragile and flickering, like a candle struggling against a gale. The dark side, on the other hand, was dense and suffocating, tempting, whispering promises of power that made his teeth grit in resistance. He could feel 1,000 whispers in his mind, alien voices speaking in tongues that twisted his memories, his fears, and his hopes into strange, grotesque shapes. They promised him victory, mastery over life and death, unimaginable power, but he recognized them for what they were: corruption. He closed his eyes and focused, drawing on his training, his years of struggle against temptation. The whispers tried to snake into his consciousness, offering visions of domination, of bending galaxies to his will, of avenging the countless injustices he had witnessed in his life. But Luke had learned the cost of such indulgence. He had stared into the abyss of the dark side before and had refused to step into it. His hand instinctively went to his lightsaber at his hip, but even that did not offer the comfort it once had. The weapon hummed faintly, but its light seemed dim in this place, almost swallowed by the surrounding darkness. The landscape shifted subtly with every blink of his eyes. What had seemed like a solid path moments ago now appeared to be a chasm of writhing shadows. Rocks rose and fell as if breathing, and the very air seemed to carry a weight that pressed on his chest, making each inhale an effort. The Force pulsed strangely, reacting to the environment with jerks and lurches that made him feel unsteady. He reached out with his mind, seeking the familiar currents, the undercurrent of life that usually flowed around him. But the Force was fragmented here, fractured by some unseen power. He felt a disturbance unlike any he had known, an energy that was chaotic, raw, and violent, yet strangely intelligent. It was a malignancy within the very fabric of reality, and it recoiled at his presence as much as it sought to consume it. A distant, shadowed shape shifted across the horizon. Luke squinted, trying to make sense of it. It was humanoid, but grotesquely distorted, towering far above anything human, with armor that glinted faintly like obsidian under a blood-red light. Every step it took seemed to warp the ground, leaving trails of dark energy that hissed and fumed, dissolving matter itself. Luke sensed the aura radiating from it: corruption, malice, and a sense of order twisted into madness. He understood then that this was no ordinary opponent. The Force screamed warnings at him, instincts honed over years of combat, alerting him that he was far out of his element, facing a threat that was as alien as it was terrifying. Yet even in this place, he felt a spark of his old resolve. The calm, steady center he had cultivated through meditation and trials allowed him to focus. He took a deep breath, feeling the hum of the Force within him, fragile but persistent. He knew he had to understand this place, to gauge its nature, before he could hope to survive. The air shimmered, and for a brief instant, he felt as if the shadows themselves were observing him, testing him, seeing whether he would crumble under the weight of this alien dimension. It was a challenge not just of skill, but of spirit. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to find safety in the familiar, yet he stayed rooted. He extended his awareness, letting the Force guide him, trying to read the energies around him. Strange, twisted forms flickered at the edge of perception. Humanoid shapes in armor that seemed fused with living metal, eyes glowing with unnatural light. They moved with a coordination that was both disciplined and chaotic, a paradox that sent shivers down his spine. He sensed the warp in everything, the sky, the ground, even the currents of the Force itself. Time seemed distorted here, moments stretching into eternity, only to snap back violently, leaving him disoriented. He focused again, centering himself in the Force, letting it flow through him like a river that refused to be dammed. The whispers tried to invade again, images of his past failures, of friends lost and worlds destroyed, but he held firm, reminding himself of the truths he had learned. The corruption around him was unlike anything the Jedi had recorded. It was not merely the pull of anger or fear. It was a living, sentient chaos, an intelligence that sought to overwhelm and consume all order. And yet, even in this overwhelming darkness, Luke felt a sliver of clarity. He understood that he had been brought here for a reason, that the Force had a path, however twisted and perilous, that he could follow. With every step forward, he felt the oppressive weight of this alien dimension, the corruption clawing at his mind. But he also felt his own strength, a resilience born of countless trials, failures, and victories. The journey had just begun, and already he realized that the confrontation he faced would test not only his skills, but his very essence.
Luke Skywalker's eyes adjusted to the warped landscape, and his senses, sharpened by years of Jedi training, tried to parse the chaos around him. The sky above pulsed with colors that should not exist, a constant writhing of crimson, green, and violet, casting unnatural shadows across jagged terrain. The air was heavy, saturated with a stench that made his stomach churn, a mix of ozone, blood, and something acrid and metallic. Every instinct screamed caution, and he moved carefully, feeling the Force ripple in unfamiliar patterns, warning him of dangers that were not like any he had faced before. Ahead, a faint movement caught his eye, a shimmer of reflective metal among the rocks and shadowed fissures. Luke slowed, igniting his lightsaber with a soft hum that seemed to echo too loudly in this distorted world. Its light, bright and reassuring in other circumstances, felt almost fragile here, barely piercing the oppressive gloom. As he approached, the figures became clearer, towering warriors in black and brass power armor, etched with runes that glowed faintly with an unholy light. Their helmets were grotesque, twisted visages of skulls and horns, visages designed to terrify. Luke could feel the malevolent aura radiating from them, a dark energy that gnawed at his connection to the Force, attempting to disrupt his focus. They moved with a deliberate, measured precision, yet there was a chaotic energy beneath their coordination, a hint of something unnatural guiding their motions. He sensed the corruption in their very presence. The Force recoiled slightly, as though it recognized the taint. Luke's grip on his lightsaber tightened instinctively, feeling the hum resonate through his hand as if the weapon itself understood the gravity of the confrontation. The air seemed to vibrate around them, charged with psychic energy that twisted reality, warping shadows and making the terrain shift subtly. The first of the Chaos Space Marines stepped forward, the sound of his boots against the jagged ground echoing in a way that felt both distant and immediate, a warped resonance that unsettled Luke's mind. He felt the intent behind the gesture, a promise of violence, a test of strength, a challenge to the light that Luke represented. Luke took a deep breath, centering himself in the Force, feeling its currents ebb and flow around him, fragile but resilient. He tried to read the minds of these beings, to anticipate their moves, but the corruption clouded their thoughts, twisted them into fragments and false signals, making the task nearly impossible. The first strike came almost immediately, a lunge of inhuman speed that forced him to react instinctively. He pivoted, deflecting the jagged blade with a flash of light, the contact sending sparks into the oppressive darkness. The sound was unnatural, like metal striking metal underwater, and he felt a ripple of pain run through his arm despite his skill. The other Chaos Space Marines advanced simultaneously, forming a circle around him, their movements coordinated yet erratic, each step seeming to distort the ground beneath them. Luke leapt backwards, using the Force to propel himself over jagged rocks, narrowly avoiding a swing from another corrupted warrior. The Force whispered warnings, showing glimpses of possible outcomes, paths of survival and destruction intertwined. Each moment required split-second decisions, combining his combat intuition with the guidance of the Force. He could feel their energy probing him, attempting to draw him into anger, fear, and doubt, the classic temptations of the dark side amplified by the warp-tainted aura surrounding them. He clenched his teeth and forced his mind clear, focusing on the present, on the rhythm of the battle, the hum of his lightsaber, the positions of his foes. Luke's strikes were precise, deflecting energy blades and twisted melee weapons, each contact sending waves of dark energy through the Force that he had to push against to resist being overwhelmed. Sparks, smoke, and a faint, acrid haze filled the air with every clash, and Luke felt the weight of exhaustion pressing against him, the unnatural environment sapping his strength even as he fought. Despite the overwhelming odds, his mind remained sharp, calculating the reach of each blade, anticipating movements, and exploiting openings, however fleeting. The Chaos Space Marines adapted quickly, their strikes becoming more unpredictable, their attacks weaving between moments of brute force and calculated precision. Luke sensed the intelligence behind the corruption, the dark strategies whispered to them by some unseen hand in the warp. He used the Force to enhance his agility, launching into flips and somersaults that allowed him to evade attacks that would have killed a normal human. He reached out with his mind, feeling the currents of the corrupted energy around him, using them to predict danger before it manifested physically, predicting swings and thrusts with uncanny accuracy. The air crackled with energy as the first of the Chaos Space Marines activated a short-range weapon, a blast of warped energy that hurled fragments of metal and stone at him. He reacted instinctively, raising his lightsaber to deflect the barrage, the air around him shimmering as sparks and energy arcs erupted from the clash. He felt the Force strain, the corruption attempting to twist his senses, to draw his focus away from the physical threats and into a mental snare of fear and doubt. He clenched his teeth and forced his mind clear, focusing on the present, on the rhythm of the battle, the hum of his lightsaber, the positions of his foes. Luke's strikes were precise, deflecting energy blades and twisted melee weapons, each contact sending waves of dark energy through the Force that he had to push against, to resist being overwhelmed. Sparks, smoke, and a faint, acrid haze filled the air with every clash, and Luke felt the weight of exhaustion pressing against him, the unnatural environment sapping his strength even as he fought. Despite the overwhelming odds, his mind remained sharp, calculating the reach of each blade, anticipating movements, and exploiting openings, however fleeting. The Chaos Space Marines adapted quickly, their strikes becoming more unpredictable, their attacks weaving between moments of brute force and calculated precision. Luke sensed the intelligence behind the corruption, the dark strategies whispered to them by some unseen hand in the warp. He used the Force to enhance his agility, launching into flips and somersaults that allowed him to evade attacks that would have killed a normal human. He reached out with his mind, feeling the currents of the corrupted energy around him, using them to predict danger before it manifested physically, predicting swings and thrusts with uncanny accuracy.
The whispers came first, subtle at first, like distant echoes bouncing through the recesses of Luke Skywalker's mind. He had encountered temptations before, the lure of power, the insidious call of anger or fear that could twist even the noblest intentions. But this was different. This was not a mere personal temptation. It was a malignant force that seemed to breathe with a consciousness of its own, reaching out to him, probing his thoughts, speaking in voices that were both alien and intimately familiar. The landscape around him shimmered with chaotic energy, the colors of the warped sky searing into his vision, yet he could barely notice it now, so strong was the psychic pressure pressing on him. It started as images, fleeting glimpses of possibilities he could not ignore. Worlds saved, entire systems brought to heel, enemies vanquished before they could strike, all within his grasp, if only he reached out and let the darkness in. The Force tried to shield him, to reinforce his resolve, but even the light felt weak here, diluted by the pervasive corruption that saturated the air and seeped into every corner of his awareness. He felt a presence, an entity that was not fully physical, but whose intelligence and malice were unmistakable. It was the warp, the raw, chaotic energy of the universe made conscious, and it had singled him out as a potential instrument. The whispers became words, then sentences, speaking in countless voices at once, overlapping, clashing, yet strangely melodic. They promised him mastery over life and death, the power to undo mistakes, to prevent loss, to exact vengeance on all who had wronged him or his allies. Luke could feel the tug, a magnetic pull at the very core of his being, coaxing him to abandon restraint, to act without hesitation, without moral constraint. His grip tightened on his lightsaber, the cool metal hilt grounding him in the tactile reality that contrasted sharply with the surreal assault on his mind. He forced his eyes closed, breathing slowly, drawing on every lesson Yoda and Obi-Wan had imparted. But the images would not cease. They pressed harder, twisting around his fears and desires, crafting visions that were almost too tempting to resist. He saw himself standing victorious over impossible odds, a savior not just of a single galaxy, but of countless worlds. He saw allies spared from death, friends never lost, enemies punished swiftly and decisively. The Force offered guidance, but the corruption sought to undermine it, showing him paths that seemed righteous, yet led inevitably into compromise. Luke's thoughts faltered for a moment, a flicker of doubt that made his heart race. Could he resist this? Could he maintain the principles that had guided him through so many trials when faced with such overwhelming promise? The whispers sensed his hesitation and intensified, wrapping around his memories, plucking at regrets and failures, magnifying them, presenting them as opportunities for action that would require no restraint. He could see himself wielding this dark power, the sheer scale of it intoxicating, an overwhelming sense of capability and control that he had never before experienced. But intertwined with the promise was a gnawing, insidious fear, a warning buried deep within the Force itself. Luke sensed that yielding, even slightly, would be irreversible, a corruption that would not merely taint him, but consume him entirely. His mind raced as he reached back through his training, recalling the moments of temptation he had overcome. The pull of vengeance against Vader, the anger at the Empire, the despair he had felt on countless battlefields.
Each memory served as both anchor and shield, a reminder of the resilience he had cultivated over a lifetime of trials. He focused on the breath, slow and steady, feeling the hum of the force within him, fragile yet persistent. The whispers tried to manipulate even this, twisting the sensations of calm into a mockery, suggesting that restraint was weakness, that hesitation was failure. Luke fought against it, the mental strain growing with each passing moment, his mind a battlefield of conflicting influences, the corruption pressing in from all sides, the force pushing back with equal intensity. He could sense the warp around him, alive and intelligent, and it sought to exploit every shadow in his mind, every unresolved doubt, every hidden desire. The more he resisted, the more insistent the whispers became, feeding on his determination, testing the boundaries of his will. He imagined giving in, just once, to see the full extent of the power on offer. The visions were vivid, seductive, entire fleets of corrupted warriors brought under his control, the ability to rewrite the outcomes of battles, to strike down chaos before it could spread further. But intertwined with the promise was the realization that every act of indulgence carried a cost, a subtle erosion of self that would accelerate into something irreversible. Luke felt his pulse quicken, his body tense, the energy of the force coursing unevenly through him as he struggled to maintain equilibrium. He reached out with his mind, attempting to grasp the currents of the force beyond the corruption, to find a thread of clarity in the storm of whispers. It was a delicate balance, a dance between the seduction of power and the necessity of restraint. He felt the force respond, fragile yet steadfast, offering glimpses of guidance and reassurance, anchoring him to his purpose. The whispers grew louder, more forceful, probing deeper, suggesting that resistance was futile, that even the strongest resolve could be worn down, that the galaxy itself demanded his submission to unlock its full potential. Luke recognized the cunning in the corruption's approach. It did not merely threaten him with pain or loss, but tempted him with fulfillment, offering visions of a future entirely shaped by his hand, a future he knew he could never achieve through conventional means. The struggle within him intensified, a constant push and pull, the force and the corruption locked in a psychic battle for his allegiance. His mind flared with images of friends and allies, of past failures and victories, of the Jedi teachings that had guided him through darkness. He clung to these memories, letting them ground him even as the whispers tried to unmoor his sense of self. Every fiber of his being was tested, his patience, his morality, his courage, and above all his ability to resist the allure of immediate, limitless power. The visions of triumph danced tantalizingly before him, yet he knew to grasp them would be to surrender the very essence of who he was. The whispers became a cacophony, a chorus of promises and threats that threatened to fracture his mind. Yet he remained steadfast, focusing on the force as a living current, a guide, a tether to the light that had carried him through so many trials. He felt a subtle shift within himself, a quiet affirmation that the path of the Jedi, though narrow and perilous, was the only way to endure the madness that surrounded him.
Luke Skywalker moved cautiously through the shattered battlefield, the twisted remnants of structures jutting from the ground like the jagged teeth of some enormous skeletal beast. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid stench of burnt armor, punctuated by the distant, unearthly shrieks of creatures born of the warp. Every step he took seemed to echo in the unnatural silence that hovered between the chaos, a silence that was less absence of sound than the suppression of it, as if the world itself were holding its breath. He sensed movement ahead, subtle at first, a ripple in the force that hinted at the presence of others, beings attuned to the energy around them but bound by fear and desperation. As he drew closer, the figures emerged from the shadows, ragged soldiers in tattered armor, their faces etched with exhaustion and disbelief. The Imperial Guard, he realized, survivors of a lost battalion, holding their ground against the relentless tide of chaos.
Their eyes widened at the sight of him, a stranger with the aura of something greater, someone who radiated calm in a place consumed by madness. Luke extended his hand subtly through the Force, a gesture of reassurance, of guidance, and the soldiers instinctively drew back slightly, uncertainty flickering in their expressions. He lowered his stance, letting the hum of his lightsaber fade to a soft glow, not a threat, but a symbol of order in the midst of the warp-tainted disorder. "We are not your enemy," he projected through the Force, his voice carrying the resonance of calm authority. The soldiers paused, scanning each other, searching for deception, but the truth in his words was evident in the steady pulse of the energy that surrounded him. Slowly, they began to gather closer, their weapons raised yet wavering, unsure whether to accept him or treat him as another threat. Luke's attention swept the perimeter, sensing traces of warp-tainted entities lurking just beyond the visible horizon, the encroaching influence of chaos pressing in like a suffocating fog. He knew that time was short and that any hesitation could cost lives. The soldiers' leader, a grizzled veteran with a scar running down the side of his face, stepped forward cautiously. He met Luke's gaze with wary defiance, the kind born of countless battles against insurmountable odds. "Who are you?" the man demanded, voice roughened by smoke and shouting, yet carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. Luke did not answer verbally. Instead, he allowed the Force to convey his intentions, a subtle projection of calm, strategy, and hope. He felt the tentative trust growing, a fragile thread binding him to these weary humans facing overwhelming odds. The veteran soldier studied him, skepticism and hope warring in his eyes, before nodding slightly and gesturing for the others to lower their weapons, though only marginally. Luke moved among them, assessing their condition, noting the exhaustion, the injuries, the fear, and the lingering haze of despair that coated them like ash. He reached out subtly through the Force, sensing potential where they saw only defeat, guiding their instincts, reinforcing their courage, and sharpening their awareness. He did not seek to dominate, but to enhance, to bring clarity where there was only confusion and terror. As he walked, he gestured towards fallen structures and debris, signaling positions of potential cover, weak points in the chaotic battlefield that could be exploited. Some of the soldiers caught on immediately, inspired by his calm confidence, while others hesitated, uncertainty flickering in their eyes as they weighed instinct against newfound hope. Luke felt the shift in the Force as they began to synchronize with his guidance, a subtle harmony forming amidst the discord of battle. He reached out further, drawing on his knowledge of tactics, both from his training as a Jedi and from experiences against overwhelming odds across the galaxy. He suggested formations, small maneuvers, defensive positions that could make the difference between survival and annihilation. The soldiers, sensing the clarity of his vision, followed, their movements becoming more confident, more coordinated. Luke could feel the difference in the air immediately. The warp-tainted energy that hung like a malignant fog around them seemed less focused, as if the growing cohesion of the human forces disrupted its influence. Small successes began to ripple across the battlefield. A suppressed fire from a chaos-corrupted gun emplacement, a tactical repositioning that saved a wounded soldier from death, moments that built morale and strengthened resolve. Luke remained vigilant, constantly sensing the balance between potential and threat, guiding without commanding, teaching without overt instruction. He allowed the Force to act as intermediary, helping soldiers anticipate attacks, maintain focus under duress, and make split-second decisions that could mean life or death. He noted the psychic disturbances emanating from the chaos-tainted figures nearby, subtle manipulations of fear and aggression meant to break the human defenders before physical attacks could land. Luke focused, using his connection to the Force to shield them, reinforcing mental fortitude and offering fleeting glimpses of clarity amidst the storm of madness. Occasionally, he moved to engage directly, deflecting psychic attacks with precise movements, his lightsaber a beacon of discipline that illuminated the surrounding darkness. Each act of intervention was measured, designed to preserve life, to maintain balance, to ensure the soldiers retained confidence in their abilities rather than becoming dependent solely on him. Gradually, a rhythm emerged, a fragile but growing synergy between Luke and the survivors. They began to anticipate his guidance, their actions harmonizing with his subtle cues, creating pockets of effectiveness that had seemed impossible moments before. Luke felt the Force respond to their collective determination, strengthening his own connection even in the presence of overwhelming corruption. He sensed that this alignment, this fragile thread of cooperation, was a seed of hope that could resist the encroaching darkness, a reminder that even in a universe dominated by war and chaos, unity and resolve could make a difference. As they moved forward together, cautiously advancing against the scattered remnants of chaos forces, Luke continued to guide, teach, and inspire, his presence a stabilizing force amid the unrelenting chaos. He understood that the battle was not only against external enemies, but also against the insidious whispers that sought to erode courage and sow despair. His role was as much to reinforce the human spirit as to combat the corrupted warriors, blending strategy, intuition, and the subtle power of the Force to turn scattered, weary soldiers into a cohesive force capable of resisting the overwhelming tide of darkness.
Luke Skywalker's senses sharpened as he stepped into the heart of the battlefield, the jagged terrain stretching endlessly under the sickly hues of a sky torn between crimson and green. Smoke and ash hung thick in the air, making every inhalation a labor, and the distant shrieks of warp-spawned creatures echoed like fractured screams through the desolate expanse. He felt the presence of chaos all around him, a pervasive, malignant energy that seemed to pulse with life, twisting the very fabric of reality. The Force itself reacted strangely here, fluctuating violently as though uncertain of how to guide him in a place so thoroughly corrupted. Ahead, a group of chaos sorcerers emerged from the shadows, their bodies shrouded in tattered robes and twisted armor, etched with glowing runes that hummed with an unnatural energy. Luke felt the malign influence radiating from them, a psychic pressure that tugged at his mind, threatening to unbalance him even as he steadied his grip on his lightsaber. The first sorcerer raised a hand, and bolts of warped energy streaked toward him with unnatural speed. Luke reacted instinctively, igniting his lightsaber and intercepting the energy mid-air. Sparks flew, searing through the acrid haze, and the weapon thrummed against the unnatural force, vibrating against his palm in a warning that this battle would test every fiber of his being. The landscape around him twisted subtly with each strike, as if reality itself was bending to the chaotic will of the sorcerers. Rocks rose and fell like breathing beasts, fissures opened in the ground, and the air shimmered with unstable energy that made every movement uncertain. Luke leapt backward, using the Force to propel himself over jagged stone, narrowly avoiding another blast that erupted from the hands of a sorcerer. The energy bolts hissed and sizzled, their trajectories almost alive, curving and shifting as if they were conscious, seeking a way to pierce his defenses. He felt the Force strain under the chaotic influence, its currents pulsing unpredictably, yet he grounded himself in the familiar rhythm of his own presence, allowing intuition and reflex to guide his movements. He advanced cautiously, each step deliberate, his eyes scanning the battlefield for openings, weaknesses, any advantage he could exploit.
The sorcerers began moving in coordinated arcs, unleashing psychic assaults that bent reality around him. Shadows elongated unnaturally, rocks convulsed under invisible pressure, and the air shimmered with unstable energy that made every movement uncertain. Luke extended his awareness through the Force, sensing the intent behind each attack, feeling the ebb and flow of energy, and predicting the moments where the chaotic currents might falter, allowing him to strike or evade. He deflected another energy bolt with a swift slash of his lightsaber, sparks cascading through the thickened air, and rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the jagged remnants of a shattered rock propelled by warp energy. Every movement required precision. Every reaction had to account for forces that were not purely physical. The chaos of the battlefield demanded that he integrate the Force with his instincts, his agility, and his understanding of combat strategy honed over years of training and experience. The sorcerers retaliated with a coordinated surge, raising their hands in unison to summon a wave of dark energy that rippled across the battlefield. Luke focused, centering himself in the Force, allowing his awareness to extend outward. He sensed subtle disruptions in the currents, imperfections in the chaotic energy that he could exploit. Timing his movements with the faintest of cues, he leapt forward, weaving between surges of destructive power, his lightsaber slicing through the trailing tendrils of warped energy. Sparks and fragments of corrupted rock exploded around him, the air thick with the scent of ozone and burning metal. He felt the psychic pressure against his mind, the whispers of corruption attempting to intrude, promising power and mastery if he allowed them into his consciousness. Luke forced his focus inward, shutting out the insidious temptations, channeling every ounce of his training to maintain clarity and resolve. The sorcerer's attacks intensified, not merely throwing bolts of energy, but attempting to ensnare him within psychic traps that distorted his perception, bending the world around him and making it difficult to distinguish reality from illusion. He felt the weight of these attacks pressing on him, the physical exhaustion compounded by mental strain, yet he pressed forward, using the Force to anticipate movements, to sense danger before it manifested physically, and to manipulate his own agility to stay one step ahead of the assault. He slashed at one sorcerer, disrupting the flow of energy around them, while simultaneously deflecting another's bolt with a flick of his wrist. The lightsaber's blade hummed in harmony with the Force, each strike resonating not only through the weapon, but through the currents of energy that flowed through the battlefield. Luke moved like water, fluid and adaptable, allowing the chaos to dictate the rhythm, only to bend it subtly to his advantage. Rocks shifted under his feet, some erupting as if the ground itself were alive, yet he adapted, leaping, rolling, and pivoting in synchronization with the subtle cues provided by the Force. He sensed a brief pause in the psychic assault, a momentary lapse in coordination among the sorcerers, and seized the opportunity to advance, striking with precision and force. Sparks and warped energy collided with his lightsaber, sending ripples through the air, and he felt the Force align momentarily, granting him a fleeting clarity that allowed him to anticipate the next movements of his adversaries. The battle was not merely physical. It was a dance of energy, perception, and willpower. Luke's mind and body operated in near-perfect synchrony with the Force, countering attacks that were impossible by ordinary standards, redirecting energy, and exploiting the flaws in the chaotic patterns. The sorcerers regrouped quickly, their movements a mix of brute psychic force and calculated strategy, forcing Luke to adapt continuously. He felt the tug of the dark currents on his own emotions, subtle yet insistent, seeking to provoke anger, fear, or despair. He resisted, grounding himself in the light, allowing patience, control, and focus to guide his responses. Each clash with their warped energy brought new insight into their methods, revealing the limits and weaknesses inherent in their reliance on chaos. He used the Force to amplify his perception, seeing openings in the patterns of attack, anticipating strikes before they occurred, and manipulating his own agility to stay one step ahead of the assault. He slashed at one sorcerer, disrupting the flow of energy around them, while simultaneously deflecting another's bolt with a flick of his wrist. The lightsaber's blade hummed in harmony with the Force, each strike resonating not only through the weapon, but through the currents of energy that flowed through the battlefield. Luke moved like water, fluid and adaptable, allowing the chaos to dictate the rhythm, only to bend it subtly to his advantage. Rocks shifted under his feet, some erupting as if the ground itself were alive, yet he adapted, leaping, rolling, and pivoting in synchronization with the subtle cues provided by the Force. He sensed a brief pause in the psychic assault, a momentary lapse in coordination among the sorcerers, and seized the opportunity to advance, striking with precision and force. Sparks and warped energy collided with his lightsaber, sending ripples through the air, and he felt the Force align momentarily, granting him a fleeting clarity that allowed him to anticipate the next movements of his adversaries.
Luke Skywalker advanced cautiously, his senses stretched taut as he stepped into a section of the battlefield that seemed almost alive with malevolence. The jagged rocks beneath his feet were slick with shadowy ichor, and the air shimmered with the oppressive heat of psychic energy. In the distance, a towering figure emerged from the haze, larger than any human or beast Luke had ever encountered. Its form was grotesque yet commanding, muscles bulging unnaturally, fused with armor that appeared both organic and metallic, adorned with spikes, sigils, and the twisted symbols of chaos. Eyes of molten light glowed from its skull-like visage, and a corona of dark energy rippled outward, warping the surrounding space. Luke could feel the power radiating from it, a pressure on his mind that made his teeth ache and his thoughts crawl with unease. The Force screamed warnings, signaling the presence of a being whose very existence challenged all notions of balance, a creature born of the warp itself and infused with centuries of hatred, violence, and ambition. His grip tightened on his lightsaber. As he stepped forward, the familiar hum of its blade, a small comfort amid the overwhelming dread. The demon prince moved with a confidence that defied its monstrous size, each step leaving a scorched imprint on the jagged ground. Luke felt the ripples in the Force with each movement, violent pulses of energy that sought to disorient and intimidate. The air between them seemed to distort, bending light and shadow, as though the battlefield itself obeyed the will of the colossal figure. Luke took a deep breath, extending his awareness through the Force, sensing the currents of power that emanated from his foe. The demon prince's presence was multifaceted, a combination of raw physical might, psychic malice, and a cunning intelligence that twisted every attack with strategic foresight. As the first strike came, a massive, clawed hand swinging with impossible speed, Luke rolled forward, narrowly avoiding impact. The ground erupted where the blow had struck, sending shards of rock and debris into the air. He responded with a swift counter, swinging his lightsaber in a precise arc, but the energy seemed to pass through the creature, as if meeting resistance at a different plane of reality. The demon prince roared, a sound that reverberated through the air, a combination of rage and satisfaction. Sparks of warp energy erupted from the ground around it, tendrils of psychic force lashing outward, seeking to ensnare him, to twist his perception, to draw him into fear and doubt. Luke felt the pull, the seductive promise that if he abandoned caution and gave in to anger, he could strike with devastating effect. He clenched his jaw, forcing clarity through the veil of intimidation and psychic assault. He had faced fear before, temptations to strike recklessly, but this was unlike any adversary he had confronted. The sheer scale of the power, the malign intelligence, and the psychic interference made conventional tactics insufficient. Luke drew deeper into the Force, letting it guide his movements, his strikes, and his mind. He had to anticipate not just physical blows, but manipulations of perception, subtle distortions designed to make him question every instinct. The demon prince lunged again, faster this time, its claws slicing through the air with arcs of shadowy fire. Luke leapt and rolled, the Force amplifying his agility,
feeling the currents around him as extensions of his own body. He struck with his lightsaber, intercepting a tendril of warp energy, the blade humming as it disrupted the flow, scattering fragments of the dark energy and sparks of light. He sensed the creature's intelligence, calculating, adapting, testing his limits, probing for weakness. Luke realized that brute strength would not suffice. He needed to combine the elegance of Jedi technique with the intuition of battle-hardened instinct. He moved laterally, drawing the demon prince forward, using the terrain to his advantage, stepping between jagged spires and fissures that emitted heat and psychic residue. Each strike of the creature reshaped the ground, forcing him to constantly reassess footing, angle, and timing. The demon prince unleashed a psychic wave, a pulse of corruptive energy that warped the space around them, bending light and shadow into nightmarish visions. Luke's mind reeled at the illusions, the screams of invisible victims echoing through his consciousness. He forced himself to concentrate, grounding himself in the Force, distinguishing the real from the manipulations, and finding openings amid the chaos. He struck again, using precise, controlled movements, aiming not to overpower, but to disrupt the creature's balance to exploit its own aggression. The demon prince retaliated with a combination of brute force and cunning, its claws and warped energy converging in ways that made his head spin with anticipation and reaction. Luke could feel the psychological pressure intensifying, the whispers of chaos attempting to infect his mind, to instill fear, anger, and hesitation. Each moment of resistance was an exercise in mental fortitude, a test of patience and clarity. Sweat beaded on his brow, his muscles ached, but his connection to the Force kept him centered, providing insight into the creature's movements, hints of strategy, and glimpses of vulnerabilities that mere observation could not reveal. He sensed the environment responding to the demon prince's presence, the ground convulsing, rocks levitating, air shimmering with raw energy, and he adapted, using the distortions as both shield and weapon, drawing the battlefield into his strategy. The creature's eyes glowed brighter, tendrils of warp energy snaking outward, striking at his mind and body, forcing him to weave between physical and psychic assaults. Luke moved fluidly, redirecting attacks, deflecting energy with his lightsaber, and channeling the Force to anticipate and counter the subtle manipulations in the creature's strikes. Each action required perfect synchronization, a balance between intuition, perception, and deliberate choice. He felt the demon prince's frustration, its rage bubbling to the surface as it realized that he was not merely reacting, but adapting, learning, resisting the psychological pressure meant to bend him. The creature roared, a seismic, bone-shaking sound that scattered debris and warped the space around them, and lunged with an even greater ferocity. Luke leapt and rolled, extending his reach with the Force, striking at exposed joints, attempting to exploit every small advantage in a battle that was otherwise overwhelmingly one-sided. The air was thick with energy, the scent of ozone and decay, and the terrain continued to shift unpredictably. Luke's mind and body operated in near-perfect harmony with the Force, every movement a combination of deflection, counterstrike, and awareness, responding simultaneously to the physical and psychic threats. The demon prince paused for a moment, assessing him with glowing eyes, and Luke felt that pause as an opportunity, a fleeting instant to read its intent and anticipate the next wave of attacks. The tension in the air was palpable, a balance between predator and prey, chaos and order, power and precision. Luke's movements became a dance of light and energy, his lightsaber a glowing extension of his will, the Force flowing through him in a constant rhythm that countered the chaotic power before him. Every step, every swing, every shift in position was both defensive and offensive, a test of endurance, skill, and clarity against a being that embodied centuries of corruption and the raw, violent power of the warp.
Luke Skywalker felt a cold weight press against his chest, an unfamiliar pressure that went beyond the physical strain of battle. The whispers of chaos had not ceased, they had only grown more persistent, weaving themselves into his thoughts, twisting memories and fears into cruel reflections. He could sense the influence creeping into his mind, subtle at first, like a faint shadow, then stronger, pressing, demanding attention. Every step he took through the shattered landscape was haunted by visions of what could be, of the potential for destruction and domination,
if only he gave in. He clenched his fists, grounding himself in the familiar rhythm of the Force, the steady hum that had guided him through darkness countless times before. Yet this was different. The corruption around him was more insidious, almost sentient, probing for weakness in a way that no Sith had ever managed. Luke had faced temptation before, had felt the pull of power and anger, but now it was amplified 1,000-fold by the warp itself, by the malignant intelligence that infused every rock, every whisper of wind, every distorted shadow around him. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, trying to separate the real from the illusions, but the visions were vivid and persuasive. He saw friends he had lost in other battles, twisted into grotesque forms, screaming for salvation that he could not provide. He saw entire systems crushed beneath the weight of forces he could not hope to stop. And in the same moment, he felt the pull of raw power, the seductive notion that he could prevent these tragedies if only he allowed himself to embrace the darkness. Luke opened his eyes, the glow of his lightsaber faint but steady in his hand, its hum a small anchor in the swirling madness. He felt the Force push back against the corruption, a subtle, patient insistence that clarity and focus could endure even in the presence of overwhelming malice. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, overlapping into a cacophony that sought to fracture his concentration, to make him doubt himself, his purpose, and the very nature of the Force he relied upon. They offered visions of victory, of omnipotence, of a universe reshaped according to his will. The temptation was intoxicating, a promise of control in a place defined by chaos. Luke felt the tug at his resolve, the familiar itch of frustration and impatience, and he reminded himself that this was the very trap the dark side thrived upon, the promise of quick solutions, the allure of decisive action without consideration of consequence. The Force whispered in response, guiding him, steadying his mind, and helping him discern reality from the seductive illusions. He felt the corruption attempt to twist the currents of the Force around him, to manipulate his perception, but he focused inward, seeking the calm center he had cultivated through years of meditation and trials. Around him, the battlefield continued to shift, the ground twisting with unnatural geometry, jagged spires rising and falling as if alive. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, forming grotesque shapes that darted just beyond the edge of vision. Luke sensed the influence of chaos in every movement, every distortion, a malevolent intelligence seeking to break his focus. He forced his attention back to the immediate threats, using the Force to perceive the flow of energy, to anticipate disturbances, to navigate the fractured reality around him. His steps were deliberate, measured, a dance of balance between caution and action. He sensed smaller presences, humans, daemons, warp-touched creatures, moving within the corrupted landscape, their motions dictated by the chaotic energies around them. Luke extended his awareness not to dominate, but to observe, to understand how he could act without succumbing to fear or aggression. The whispers pressed harder, feeding on his frustrations, on fleeting doubts that he barely noticed, attempting to draw him into anger or despair. He felt the pull, the suggestion that he could strike out, that he could use this energy to eliminate the threat with sheer force, but he resisted, remembering the lessons of patience, of measured action, of using the Force as a guide rather than a weapon for indulgence. The corruption's influence seeped into his very perception, warping his senses, blending reality with illusion, twisting familiar shapes into monstrous distortions. Luke's mind raced, struggling to maintain clarity, yet he drew strength from the Force, focusing on the constants, the hum of his lightsaber, the rhythm of his breath, the steady pulse of life that remained untainted. He advanced carefully, each movement a negotiation between instinct and awareness, a balancing act designed to protect both himself and those he could guide through this chaos. He could sense the emotional currents of the battlefield, the fear, the despair, the hopelessness, and he reached out subtly through the Force, offering a stabilizing presence, a whisper of calm to counter the insidious influence pressing in from all directions. The whispers shifted, recognizing resistance, changing tactics, suggesting deception, betrayal, and self-interest as paths to survival and victory. Luke countered with focus, filtering the false from the true, the seductive from the essential, letting only what reinforced clarity and purpose reach his consciousness. He felt the corruption pressing inward, tugging at his instincts, tempting him to react impulsively. Yet he held firm, his mind a bastion against the seductive chaos that sought to fracture him. Every decision, every movement was a test, a battle not merely against external threats, but against the inner currents of fear, doubt, and desire that the warp amplified and twisted. Luke walked through the landscape, aware of every distortion, every ripple in the Force, every shift in the corrupted energies around him. He remained vigilant, sensing patterns in the chaos, exploiting weaknesses, not with brute force, but with insight and adaptability, understanding that the struggle was as much mental and spiritual as it was physical. The whispers intensified, promising that surrendering even momentarily would grant him power beyond imagination. Yet he resisted, grounding himself in the light, in patience, in purpose, allowing clarity and reason to guide him through the swirling miasma of corruption. He felt the pull of darkness and the counterweight of the Force in delicate balance, an invisible tension that tested every fiber of his being, and he focused on the one constant, the necessity of remaining true to himself, to the principles that had carried him through every challenge, and to the Force as a guide in a universe unrecognizable and fractured by the influence of chaos.
Luke Skywalker stepped cautiously across the warped terrain, his senses stretched taut by the oppressive presence of chaos that seemed to ooze from every crack in the jagged ground. The air shimmered unnaturally, thick with psychic residue and a stench of decay that clawed at his lungs with every breath. Shadows flickered and twisted at the edges of his vision, forming grotesque shapes that writhed just beyond perception, and the sky above churned in sickly hues of green and crimson, casting distorted reflections across the jagged landscape. The Force pulsed around him, irregular and violent, as if the corruption that saturated this world sought to repel him, to bend his perception, to disorient him at every turn. He felt it in the ground beneath his feet, the air that clung to his skin, and in the oppressive weight that pressed upon his chest, a suffocating presence that seemed to challenge his very existence. As he moved forward, a sudden ripple in the Force alerted him to movement ahead. Twisted forms emerged from the darkness, humanoid but grotesque, their bodies fused with corrupted machinery and armor etched with glowing runes that radiated malevolent energy. Each step they took warped the terrain, leaving scorched footprints and fissures in the jagged stone. Luke felt the overwhelming pressure of their collective presence, a psychic wave that sought to overwhelm his mind, to draw him into fear, anger, and despair. His hand instinctively went to his lightsaber, igniting it with a steady hum that cut through the oppressive quiet. Yet even its light seemed fragile, barely piercing the corruption-laden air. The corrupted warriors advanced, their movements a mix of deliberate coordination and chaotic unpredictability, each strike an amalgam of physical and psychic assault. Luke felt the Force strain against the onslaught, sensing their intent even as their actions threatened to overwhelm his perception. He moved with precision, weaving between attacks, deflecting warped energy with his blade, and striking where openings appeared, exploiting the tiniest flaws in their coordination. Every movement demanded absolute focus. Hesitation would be fatal in the presence of such malign influence.
The air crackled with energy as another wave of psychic attacks surged toward him, distorting reality, bending shadows and light into nightmarish illusions. Luke felt the force guiding him, a thread of stability in the midst of chaos, allowing him to anticipate the attacks and respond with a combination of intuition, agility, and raw skill. He rolled beneath a swinging arm, the impact erupting behind him in shards of stone and dark energy, and leapt over the jagged remains of a collapsed spire, narrowly avoiding the surge of power that erupted in his path. The corrupted warriors adapted rapidly, their strikes becoming more erratic, combining brute force with subtle psychic manipulation, forcing him to remain alert not only to physical danger but also to the insidious distortions of perception. Luke extended his awareness through the force, feeling the patterns of energy around him, sensing slight hesitations, subtle flaws in timing, and moments of vulnerability he could exploit. He struck with his lightsaber, intercepting a tendril of warped energy mid-air, the hum of the blade resonating with the force, scattering the corruptive wave in sparks of light and raw power. The psychic pressure pressed harder, a chorus of whispers seeping into his mind, offering visions of domination, of absolute power if he abandoned restraint, if he gave in to the very corruption he sought to resist. Luke felt the tug at his will, a seductive lure that promised victory and control over a reality that seemed impossibly hostile. He centered himself in the force, breathing deliberately, drawing on every lesson learned from training under Yoda and Obi-Wan, grounding his resolve in clarity and purpose. He understood that yielding, even momentarily, would lead to a cascade of consequences, a corruption not only of his body and mind, but of the very essence of his being. As he engaged, the battlefield seemed to respond, the jagged terrain shifting with the rhythm of combat, rocks rising and falling like living entities, fissures opening beneath him, and twisted debris swirling with dark energy. Luke adapted fluidly, using his agility and force-enhanced perception to navigate the unstable ground, finding leverage where none seemed to exist, and exploiting every micro-opportunity to strike or evade. He could feel the corrupted warriors' frustration mounting, their psychic attacks becoming more erratic, attempting to manipulate his emotions, to provoke anger or fear that could tip the balance in their favor. Luke remained steady, allowing his training to guide him, channeling focus and patience through every movement, every strike, every extension of the force he employed. The clash of light and dark energy filled the air with sparks and distorted currents, the hum of his lightsaber a counterpoint to the crackling psychic surges that threatened to envelop him. He anticipated the next wave, stepping into a rhythm dictated by the subtle flows of the force rather than the chaotic attacks themselves. Striking at weak points, deflecting with precision, and redirecting energy to maintain balance. Each motion was a combination of defense and offense, blending strategy, intuition, and raw reaction, a continuous cycle of adaptation in a battlefield that constantly sought to destabilize him. Luke's awareness extended to the surrounding environment, sensing the influence of the corruption in every shadow, every jagged spire, every shift in the air, allowing him to move with near-prescient timing and precision. He could feel the moments when the corrupted warriors overextended, when their psychic attacks faltered, and he exploited these openings with swift, decisive action. The battle was as much mental as it was physical. The whispers sought to fracture his resolve, to distort perception and manipulate emotions, but Luke resisted, holding fast to the light within him, maintaining a calm center amid the storm of chaos. Sparks of energy exploded around him as lightsaber met warped energy, and the jagged ground trembled under the force of the psychic assaults. Luke pressed forward, moving through the battlefield with the grace of a practiced combatant, using every advantage offered by the force, every shift in energy, every misstep of his opponents to maintain the initiative. The corrupted warriors regrouped, their strategy shifting in response to his actions, and Luke adjusted seamlessly, reading the flow of the battle, predicting attacks and countering with precision and adaptivity. He could sense the subtle threads of intent, the hidden patterns within the chaos, and used them to maintain control over the situation, guiding his movements and decisions with the steady hand of the force.
Each moment was a test of endurance, focus, and clarity, demanding every ounce of skill and concentration he possessed. The battlefield remained hostile, the corruptive influence pervasive and unrelenting, yet Luke moved with purpose, each action a balance of defense, attack, and awareness, navigating the shifting terrain and psychic turbulence with the unyielding resolve of a Jedi fully attuned to the Force.
Luke Skywalker's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped into the epicenter of the chaos incursion, a place where the very air seemed to writhe with malignant energy. The ground beneath his feet was jagged and unstable, littered with twisted remnants of machinery and scorched stone, and the sky above churned in grotesque hues of sickly green and deep crimson, as though the universe itself recoiled from the corruption that had taken root. The Force pulsed around him in erratic, violent waves, distorted by the warp-tainted presence of the enemy, and Luke had to anchor himself with every fiber of his being to maintain clarity. He could feel the psychic pressure radiating from the chaos forces ahead, a constant tug at his consciousness, whispering threats and temptations alike, seeking to bend his mind to despair, anger, or fear. The first figures emerged from the haze, Chaos Space Marines, towering and formidable, their armor adorned with spikes, corrupted sigils, and glowing malevolent runes. Their eyes, hidden behind visored helmets, radiated hatred and cunning, and each step they took seemed to distort the ground beneath them, a subtle tremor that spoke of unnatural strength and warp-tainted influence. Luke ignited his lightsaber with a familiar hum, its blade a beacon of light cutting through the oppressive darkness, yet even its glow felt fragile in the face of such overwhelming malevolence. He moved forward cautiously, every step deliberate, attuned to the currents of the Force that rippled around him, guiding his instincts, sharpening his reflexes, and heightening his awareness to every threat, both physical and psychic. The Chaos Space Marines advanced as one, their movements coordinated, yet tainted by chaotic influence, their weapons and claws striking with inhuman precision and unpredictability. Luke felt the air hum with psychic energy as their combined presence pressed against his mind, a wave of aggression and malice that sought to intimidate and destabilize him before physical combat even began. He leapt sideways to avoid the first strike, rolling across jagged stone and using the Force to propel himself into a defensive stance, ready for the next assault. Sparks and shards of debris erupted where attacks collided with the ground, and he could sense the malignant intelligence orchestrating each motion, probing for weaknesses, testing his responses, and attempting to exploit any hesitation. The clash of blade and claw sent shockwaves through the battlefield, warping shadows and stirring the twisted terrain into convulsions that threatened to throw him off balance. Luke adjusted with fluid precision, using the Force to anticipate movements, read intentions, and exploit even the tiniest gaps in their coordination. Each swing of his lightsaber was a blend of defense and attack, deflecting deadly blows while countering with calculated strikes aimed at vulnerable points in armor or body. The psychic assault intensified, and Luke felt the whispers of the warp intruding, seductive and insidious, offering glimpses of power and victory if only he would surrender to rage and abandon restraint. He forced clarity into his mind, focusing on the principles that had guided him through countless trials, rejecting the temptation and centering himself in the light of the Force. The ground trembled as a Chaos Space Marine swung a massive chain blade, each strike generating arcs of distorted energy that threatened to cleave through both matter and perception. Luke leapt and rolled, extending the Force to anticipate each strike, feeling the subtle shifts in momentum and intent that allowed him to evade certain death and respond with precise, measured blows. The corrupted warriors adapted rapidly, their tactics shifting with uncanny speed, combining brute force with warp-enhanced manipulation of the environment, forcing him to constantly reassess positioning, timing, and strategy.
He felt the force flowing around him, guiding him through the chaos, revealing patterns within the disorder, subtle cues that allowed him to exploit weaknesses, anticipate attacks, and maintain a delicate balance between offense and defense. As he engaged, Luke sensed a new dimension of the threat: psychic projection, distortions of perception meant to instill fear and doubt, bending reality itself into nightmarish illusions. Shadows became enemies, whispers became commands, and the terrain shifted unpredictably, yet he moved with unwavering focus, distinguishing the real from the illusion through the force. Sparks and warped energy cascaded with each parry, the hum of his lightsaber resonating with the force, acting as both shield and instrument to redirect aggression. Luke struck again, a precise series of blows that disrupted the rhythm of his foes, exploiting the micro-openings created by their overreach and impatience. The Chaos Space Marines, sensing their coordination challenged, attempted to recalibrate, moving with more erratic patterns, yet each action was still tainted by the warp, and Luke read the subtle imperfections, turning chaos against itself. His muscles burned, his mind strained under the constant psychic and physical pressure, but he remained fluid, adapting with the force as a living guide, blending intuition, skill, and tactical reasoning. Each step and swing became part of a larger rhythm, a flow that countered the raw aggression of the enemy with precision and foresight, maintaining both survival and initiative in a battle where the odds seemed impossibly stacked against him. The battlefield itself became an active participant. Jagged stones rose and fell, fissures opened beneath advancing foes, and warped energy surged unpredictably, yet Luke moved as if part of the terrain, using it to redirect attacks, shield allies, and create openings. The Chaos forces pressed harder, their psychic projections intensifying, seeking to corrupt his mind and erode resolve, whispering visions of despair and power alike, aiming to fracture his will. He resisted, holding fast to the teachings of the Jedi, centering himself in the Force, letting patience and clarity guide his every movement, striking decisively only when opportunity aligned with strategy. He felt the currents of the Force intertwine with his instincts, granting a heightened awareness that allowed him to anticipate threats moments before they materialized, to redirect momentum, and to maintain equilibrium in a battlefield that constantly sought to unbalance him. Sparks and warped energy collided with each clash, yet Luke pressed forward, each movement a combination of adaptation, precision, and willpower, navigating both the physical and psychic turbulence with unwavering focus, a solitary beacon of light against the encroaching darkness of chaos.
Luke Skywalker advanced cautiously through the shattered remnants of a city consumed by the chaotic forces that had erupted without warning. The streets were warped and fractured, buildings twisted into impossible angles, their walls scorched and etched with the blackened, glowing sigils of chaos. Smoke and ash hung thick in the air, carrying with them the acrid stench of burned metal and flesh. And the shadows seemed to writhe with a life of their own, dancing and stretching unnaturally across the jagged landscape. The Force itself pulsed erratically here, a turbulent current that responded to the presence of chaos, warping perception and tugging at the edges of his consciousness. Every step Luke took felt like a negotiation with reality itself, the ground trembling beneath his feet and the air thick with psychic resonance that pressed against his mind. He could feel the whispers of the warp around him, subtle at first, teasing and probing, and then more insistent, seeping into his thoughts with promises of power, visions of domination, and temptations to use abilities beyond the limits of the Jedi teachings. His hand tightened around his lightsaber, the hum of the blade a constant reassurance and a beacon of clarity amidst the encroaching madness. As he moved forward, he sensed a disturbance ahead, a gathering of energy that was both malevolent and intelligent. Emerging from the shadows were the constructs of Dr. Eggman, warped and amplified by the corrupting influence of chaos. Machines that had once been clever but harmless, now pulsed with dark energy, their metallic forms twisted and fused with unnatural organic growths. Eyes of glowing malice scanned the area, and the sounds of mechanical servos intermingled with psychic hums, creating a symphony of menace that vibrated through the very air.
Luke could feel the synchronization of these corrupted constructs, an intelligence amplified by the warp, operating with a precision that belied the chaos around them. Each movement, each strike, was calculated to test his defenses and probe his reactions, combining brute force with cunning strategy. He extended his awareness through the force, sensing the patterns of energy, predicting the trajectories of attacks, and locating the subtle weaknesses in the corrupted machines. Sparks flew as his lightsaber met the jagged edges of twisted metal, slicing through corrupted armor with careful precision, while deflecting bursts of warp energy that flared unpredictably. The battlefield itself seemed alive, responding to the combined forces of Eggman's creations and the warp's influence. Debris shifted under invisible pressures, fissures opened and closed as if the ground breathed, and warped light bent unnaturally, disorienting any observer untrained in the nuances of the force. Luke moved fluidly, rolling and leaping, extending his perception to anticipate attacks before they manifested physically, countering psychic distortions with clarity of mind and precise action. The corrupted machines launched coordinated assaults, some firing energy blasts infused with dark energy, others moving with alarming speed to strike at his flanks. Luke deflected and parried, but he also used the force to manipulate momentum, redirecting attacks and leveraging the unstable terrain to his advantage. Each encounter was a test not only of combat skill, but of mental fortitude, the warp-infused machinery attempting to unbalance him, to push him into anger or fear, knowing that such emotions could erode control and open a path to corruption. The whispers grew louder, interwoven with the mechanical sounds of Eggman's constructs, offering promises of power, a victory beyond imagining, if only he would allow himself to embrace what the battlefield seemed to demand. Luke resisted, centering himself in the light of the Force, grounding his thoughts in clarity, patience, and the principles that had guided him through countless trials. He could feel the ebb and flow of energy around him, sensing not just attacks, but the intentions behind them, the subtle shifts that revealed overextension, hesitation, or predictable patterns in the movements of the corrupted machines. Each observation allowed him to strike decisively, to parry and redirect, to exploit weaknesses without yielding to the seduction of raw power. The corrupted machines adjusted rapidly, their movements becoming more unpredictable, their attacks less coordinated, yet still dangerous due to the warp's enhancement of their reflexes and cunning. He countered, weaving through the battlefield with a combination of agility, foresight, and force-guided intuition, his movements a continuous negotiation between offense and defense, adaptation and initiative. Sparks and warped energy erupted around him as he engaged, and the jagged terrain shifted with every impact, forcing him to remain constantly aware of his footing and surroundings. The psychic pressure pressed in, a constant hum at the edge of consciousness, attempting to induce frustration, fear, or desperation. But Luke's resolve remained steady, his mind a bastion of focus, and his connection to the Force tethered to clarity amidst the chaos. As he struck and evaded, he noticed subtle patterns in the machinery's attacks, the rhythmic pulses of warp energy that powered their assault, and he used these patterns to anticipate movements, to step into the flow rather than against it, and to turn the momentum of the corrupted machines against themselves. The battle was exhausting, a constant interplay of observation, reaction, and projection through the Force. Luke's senses were stretched to their limits, yet he remained fluid, moving with grace and precision, maintaining awareness of both physical and psychic threats. Sparks flew as lightsaber met twisted metal, energy pulses collided in midair, and debris swirled chaotically around him. Yet each movement was deliberate, calculated, and guided by the Force. He felt the subtle shifts in energy, the pressure points in the psychic currents, and the small openings that appeared when the corrupted machines overextended or miscalculated. Exploiting these, he struck that disrupted their flow, dismantled segments of the machinery, and created temporary breathing room amidst the onslaught.